provide critical sustenance and services and community mobilization. And they may have most plausible cover or alibi for being in remote and unstable areas. And even comparative autonomy of action sometimes. We'll talk about that later. So how do aid organizations operationalize what they feel is their own responsibility to protect? For over a decade, they've fostered protection through their mainstream aid mission, making their programs more sensitive to conflict. They've come a long way in that regard. And secondly, they foster protection through an expanded mission, some would say mission creep, addressing rights, governance, rule of law, and civil society, all with the aim of preempting violence. I see two other areas of big potential. As I mentioned, I think one is to support local capacity for self-protection in and of itself. The other is to support, as I said, a two-way understanding, better understanding and awareness between local and outside protection efforts. In regard to this first area of supporting local capacity for self-protection, I agree with Ms. William Pope, one of our very good conference organizers, who wrote that there's much that NGOs can learn and provide in terms of community preparedness. So if violence does occur, communities have the strongest possibilities of survival. There are already, of course, some precedents in NGO support of what you call local, physical, tactical protections. In the area of safety, aid organizations, not just peacekeepers and units here, but aid organizations have supported community policing, okay, your various forms of community watch groups, patrolling, etc. And that can sometimes, some circumstances, be taken to the next level. Aid agencies have also been deeply involved with disaster, natural disaster risk reduction. The analogy, the comparison is not at all perfect, but at least it shows that aid organizations can work with local populations on physical, tactical protections. In the area of sustenance, aid organizations have increasingly supported civilians' emergency livelihood in the middle of conflict. That's right, in the middle of conflict. And sometimes that can be taken to the next level. And lastly, in the area of services, aid organizations have increasingly provided remote support to low-profile service delivery by indigenous providers in the middle of conflict. And this too is something that can sometimes be taken to the next level. These are useful precedents, I think. But given that many of the best and brightest individuals and institutions in the aid world have long said it's vital to support civilian capacity for self-preservation before violence hits, I think it's fair to say that this goal can still be addressed much more systematically. Even aid organizations have a lot more listening and learning to do about local self-protection. One proposal for a more systematic approach has been put forward by the CUNY Center, the organization I'm affiliated with. The approach is called preparedness support. Copies of that paper on that subject will also be available to those who are interested. In brief, very brief, preparedness support consists of advisory modules, if you want to call them that, menus really, for talking with local beneficiaries, local staff and partners about having safety and sustenance and services onto a crisis footing before it's too late. As you wonder in your mind what this might look like, don't imagine formal trainings or prefabricated programs with Western faces in the lead. Instead, imagine word-of-mouth approaches. Mr. New talked about how people shared amongst themselves strategies for survival. And this is the most common ways by which strategies are transmitted. It's rarely done with a formal, probably never in a formal seminar setting like this. So So imagine in your mind approaches based on word of mouth, perhaps using what, warden-based networks that follow the local social architecture for self-protection, the networks. And imagine in your mind discrete, I shouldn't say training of trainers, because training is not the word I want to use, but you understand the pedagogy I'm talking about that exponentially grows as one group passes learning on to another. These type of approaches that are always be based on mutual listening and sharing of protection methods. Such discretion and such a support role as opposed to the center stage role for protection that we organizations currently assume might be a welcome development in terms of buffering aid organizations' neutrality and restraining their mission creep. Now, the second area of potential for aid organizations that I mentioned is to support mutual two-way awareness or understanding between local and outside protection efforts. I apologize for the terrible generalization I make when I use words like locals and outsiders, when I use pronouns, us and them, we and they. I have a problem with pronouns. But that's just serving as shorthand now for a short talk. I hope you understand that. I feel there's often a very big disconnect between how locals, there we go, in the path of danger and we outsiders perceive protection. Maybe you feel there's a disconnect too. I'm much less confident about this part of my discussion. I will need your help with it. But let me think out loud and ask a few questions rather than try to make points about things like warning about which I have no authority. One question is this: who is the outsider's warning wired to? Is it wired to governmental or civil society institutions? Those institutions are very valuable, but when mass violence arrives, they're very often polarized and paralyzed. They very often become ineffective or cease even to function. Is it wired to locals actually in harm's way? Not every host national can be called local. Those who partner with our programs and systems and technologies are often relatively cosmopolitan, and they're not necessarily seen as belonging to the affected communities. And even if they do belong, they're not necessarily the ones whom others will trust and follow on crucial decisions like getting out of harm's way should be necessary. And more questions. What's the outsider's warning plugged into, so to speak? To a response for resolving conflict? Okay, that's a plan A response. Will it be enough? Maybe it's wired for response for sending in rescuers? Okay, but that very rarely happens. Maybe it's wired to response to trigger rapid public use of MSS or other information technologies. Okay. But is that action tied to any pre-existing plans of action? Or is it a response for helping civilians get themselves out of harm's way? This is one, as you can see, I'm urging that you consider, but it's very rare. And then there are questions for local leadership as well. What outsider protections or protective efforts are locals aware of and availing of? Are they joined up with efforts to raise an alarm or advocacy? Sometimes yes, often not. Are they perhaps synced up with peacekeeping missions? This is going to sound a little controversial, and I'm not advocating per se, but listen, when peacekeeping missions are chronically hamstrung by caveats about protecting civilians if facing imminent threat, if in the area of operation, if resources available allow, then locals may be able to help their protectors They may be able to help their protectors with the strategic arithmetic here. Local capacity, like community policing, warning, temporary flight, that's wired to peacekeepers. And joined up with peacekeeper, tactical response could save lives, perhaps. Obviously, this would need to be weighed against possible risks of affiliating or associating with the peacekeeping mission. Well, if there is interest, and I say if there's interest in seeing inside and outside protection efforts better harmonized, then the ground needs to be better prepared. I often compare warning to an air supply drop. If the drop zone is not well prepared, if the reception party is not organized, if the distribution of goods and other considerations downstream are not planned, then the result will be diminished, dysfunctional, and even dangerous. There simply needs to be social organization and contingency planning on the ground of an ICT platform, like an airdrop, is to be effective. We live in an ever more connected world, but this process of inside, outside, in, inside out, outside in, mutual awareness needs more last mile connectivity. Early warning, as you know, is not just a matter of transmission, whether it's cell phone calls or text messages or Google Earth images. The plug-in is not just an not just a matter of good organizational coordination or technological prowess, it's psychological too. It requires not just proofs, but persuasion. It's unnatural to prepare yourself for conflict, to take the steps that may be necessary. As threats grow, some civilians will be skeptical and underreact, and others will be panicked and scared and overreact. Both frames of mind can be dangerous. So early warning needs to be nuanced and channeled to something constructive. These are circumstances for which the R2P or early warning proponent probably needs an interpreter or a downward adapter, if that makes sense. And these are circumstances for which local leaders may well need an interpreter upward or an upward adapter. So again, I come back to the aid organization, whether indigenous or expatriate, at this pivot or swing role on the ground. I don't want to make this sound easy at all, it's not. Yes, aid organizations do have comparative advantages, but they have limitations too. Not all aid NGOs are grounded enough, accepted enough in a given locality to play this role. This limitation can apply not only to expatriate organizations, but indigenous ones as well. They don't always have the requisite awareness, trust, and context on the ground. Not all aid NGOs have the organizational strength, and not all NGOs want to get down in the dirt and support the physical, tactical aspects of civilian self-protection. We can talk about that later. Finally, not many aid organizations can do the things that international R2P and early warning groups can, and you might be well advised not to try to reinvent that wheel, but rather partner with such groups. Maybe partner is too strong a word. I know there are sensitivities involved. Many in the world still associate R2P with political and military intervention, despite the fact that there are these other important elements to it, such as prevention and warning. But I think your three communities have enough goals in common and already do have a track record of collaboration. By that I refer to aid NGOs having done discrete monitoring and confidential reporting of political instability and human rights abuses. Though that reporting has not typically been wired toward locals in harm's way, it has been wired upward in ways that helped early warning practitioners and R2P advocates. Given that foundation, and I'll finish here, I think it's plausible for you to push further on collaboration. I think it's advisable that you pay attention even more to each other's complementary and comparative advantages. Of course, the community that often has the most important comparative advantages in regard to protection is the local community. I think we all need to find methods for mutually listening and sharing with them. Local self-protection is not a panacea at all, it is not. But as I said, it will be the last protection standing when violence shuts the world out. This should be the next frontier in protection work. The next step should be to give aid organizations more documentation on locals' capacity to survive and serve each other amid violence. And then the guidance and financial support to do this, to pilot something like this. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Casey. That was a very, very interesting presentation and a good way to start today, I think, to get us all thinking about different ways that we can work with community.